It's your anniversary.
All right, we do have real quick housekeeping. We do need to approve our minutes from our previous P&G committee meeting, so I'd entertain the motion for that.
I move that we approve the last P&G minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Excellent work. All right, we've moved down to our one topic here, our cell phone policy. I'll probably just kick it over to you, Matt, and you can let anybody else jump in that wants to.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and welcome to those of you that don't usually join us for P&G. And we want to welcome in Eliza and Lucas too, sitting in with us. You're kind of getting continuing to get involved with the board level work, and thanks to Brady for attending and Adam as well to provide their input. But we had a request from a director to talk about cell phones, and then we kind of touched on this really briefly at a meeting and said we were going to potentially do a work session, then decided to start it in P&G since it is really a policy perspective. And so what you see loaded there for you this evening is what's from our CBA, our comprehensive behavior approach, and that talks about technology use expectations. And so the way I've kind of been describing to you this to you guys as we've talked about it in our check-ins over the last couple of weeks has been, that's kind of our umbrella, right? This is the overarching policy that then buildings write their specific cell phone use expectations or policies from. And so I really think the conversation would be, do we need to tighten this up more from a district level to have our buildings to be more consistent, or are we okay with the level of flexibility that's in here? You saw when we uploaded the different handbooks around this that we did have some discrepancies between buildings. I think there's probably good and bad things to that. Some of what we're talking about with high reliability schools ask buildings to have some autonomy, right, to do things that work for them and respect their systems and their structures. There's also some things that could not be good to that, right? When maybe one building has a really good practice and is doing really well with it, and we continue to have another building that struggles with the practice, and should we be trying to align those? So I think you could argue both cases. I think the other thing I would, if community is listening to this, I'd want people to understand is that we know this has been a struggle. I think that's what we said at the board table is anytime you would have students go home for the amount of time that our students went home and have access to technology in a pretty unlimited fashion, trying to renorm those behavior expectations back in school is a struggle. And we've seen that from just general behavior concerns all the way to social media concerns, technology concerns, what have you. And so this is a reflection of that, right? This is something we're still working to try to reteach expectations and positive behavior for our students. So with that said, I think the caution we should consider is not writing a policy that then puts us into a position where it's really difficult for our buildings to enforce, and it's too prescriptive, and it's, I don't want to say too taxing, but just not manageable, right? Because we could quickly find ourselves in a scenario too where we see, I think, discipline outcomes that are disparate and create some equity concerns for us. I think we could see our building principals spending unreasonable amounts of time trying to enforce cell phone expectations and policies that don't work. And so with that, I do think there has to be some autonomy, again, given to them to be able to make sure they design something that works for them. All the while, as a district, what do we set up for consistent expectations? They should build off of that. So that was more than I planned to say when we opened this, but that's kind of the things that have been rolling around in my head, and you guys have probably heard me say some of those things like I mentioned in our check-ins. But with that, I would just, I guess, let you guys jump in and see what questions you have for us or what additional perspective we could provide based on what's in front of you.
Matt, thank you for opening with that much information. And as I was listening to you talk about high reliability schools and the importance of having building autonomy, that brought me down to number 7, where I struggled a little bit with that item. Students may use cell phones, smartphones, or other handheld or wearable devices with staff permission only in accordance with each building's policy. For me, I would like to see something that's similar across the board for elementary schools, junior highs, and high schools. Where is that a way that we can then also, they would have built-in policy, but it looks very similar, because what we saw uploaded was a little bit different for even our high schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would be reasonable for us. I know that's just even from talking to some of the principals today, they've done work on this over the summer, right? And they've heard concerns even from their own staff and students and parents as they went through last year. And so some of them have rethought or looking at re-implementing some policies as they approach August. I think we could pull those, put those together and see what variances we have. I mean, those handbooks that we grabbed for you last time were from the start of last school year, so they could either be consistent or a little bit different based on some of the changes I was just talking about. And then we could then again measure our comfort with, okay, are these too different? Or are they similar enough? And then maybe even based on what we see there, we could build our expectations around that and be a little bit more prescriptive even in our policy. I think Sean had an idea one time we were talking about saying in accordance with each building or district policy, right? And
Yeah, either or, I'm not sure the semantics of it, but you have, and the district policy is broad strokes, but we're going to say this is true for, you can have it at all the schools, or say this is what we have at secondary, we have at elementary, but this is happening everywhere.
Mhm.
And then the schools can have maybe some fine tuning beyond that, but you have to make sure that they're following all of it. I mean, that's one way to get, consistency across the board and still allow for variability when needed.
Adam, can I put you on the spot really quick? Or now I just said it, so it's out there. But yeah, so get prepared with the joke time I gave you here. But would you just speak a little bit to why we framed it as technology use expectations at the district level rather than just specifically around cell phones, and then probably how that might also impact what the buildings write for specific protocols and practices for their own campuses?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements, it actually speaks to some of the desire for consistency, is consistency in policy as it relates to electronic devices that are accessing information on the internet, whatever that device may be. When students are on campus, there are certain rules that really apply, per this policy and per other board policies, regardless of how the student is accessing internet resources. And there are certain staff rights, responsibilities that apply again to whether the student is using a district-issued device, whether the student is using a personal cell phone, whatever the case may be. Oftentimes that distinction, if we have a policy specific to student cell phones and only student cell phones, or student computers for that matter, because a student can bring their own computer on campus as well. We see far less of that, but they can. If we have policies that are specific to student-owned devices beyond those circumstances where they need to be because they're not owned by the district, we can't take it away forever, for example. When we get into situations where we have policies that differ depending upon the device, it becomes very difficult to enforce. It's very difficult for teachers to keep track of. I'm trying to deal with a situation, maybe there's a behavior incident that's arisen from use of technology. Oh wait, is this student-owned technology versus district? We want it to be consistent kind of across the board to whatever extent we can.
Yeah, I think you made a good summary there and a good point. I mean, part of it could be if you take away the student's phone, they're smart enough to transfer just the medium, right? That they'll just use their Chromebook to do essentially what they were doing. And so that's why really when our buildings think about the practice, it's not as always easy just as taken away from the phone. I mean, they're going to find another access point to technology. Right, a little bit easier even for our secondary kids to do that, right, than the elementary kids, just based on the nature of the classroom transition times and the amount of opportunities secondary kids would have to potentially get into that. But that's why I just thought that was an important point to make about why we don't have something just specific to cell phones.
Well, I'm looking at paragraph 1 under student-owned technology searches and confiscation of cell phones. And it seems to me that paragraph is specific to cell phones. Well, I guess the phrase student-owned technology might be more encompassing than cell phones.
Yes,
But then the operative clause is the device can be confiscated if a cell phone is if it's a cell phone, but if it's being used at a time when cell phones are not permitted. So one of the questions I have with that clause is that, are we having problems with defining or not permitted? Is that a
You mean as
difficult-
far as
Yeah.
when it's okay to have the phone out, when it's
Yeah,
not?
yeah. Is that a difficulty across buildings, between classrooms?
Yeah, I think the consistency around that, I think that's what I heard Amy kind of say over here on the side too, is probably the problem, Charlie. Like, there might be sometimes even in a 45-minute class that it's okay, and then other times it's not, right? So I think that's the challenge for teachers every day. And then for the buildings, is it okay during passing time to have your phone out? And then what about when they enter the classroom? And then you think about that our students are navigating 5 to 7 different personalities of teachers during the day, and they may have different expectations around that. That's then the challenge of the building leader to say, okay, we need to be more consistent because our kids are struggling to navigate. If Brady allows them to use their phone their first 10 minutes and then, turn the attention to what he's doing, or if some teacher says absolutely none, those are very different expectations. And so that's where that building level consistency is important too. But if we would try to define that here, I think we'd have a really difficult time being able to do that. I don't think that would make a lot of sense for us trying to define the times that are permitted beyond what's already in the agreement.
Well, this paragraph to me says, this document is not trying to define that.
Right, I don't think it is to a very large scope.
To the
I think this is
building.
giving-
That it's okay with the staff?
Sorry.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think there are some that would like, I mean, it was that's a good question if it's okay with the staff. Staff are probably all over the map on this, I'll be honest with you. There's probably some that would like a very strict district level policy that they think could be implemented with absolute, universal fidelity. And I'm not sure, I don't think that that's possible, to be honest. And there's others that definitely have different viewpoints about, cell phone use. There's people that use it and they say, okay, the first couple of minutes for community building, if you need to text mom, something, you can chit chat and you're building community in your classroom and you're allow students to have their phone out in the first few minutes and then we get settled into our routines. Some people found that to be very successful. Would it be in line with what I do? No, but this is me. I will say too, I don't want to out my wife, but she teaches art and teaches digital photography, so they definitely have units where they're using their phones for photography, and I would say that that's a pretty defensible use. So I think the challenge is that, when you get into conversations with staff, that you're in a whole series of rabbit holes. I think, to me, the building level conversation where you're developing a partnership with your students, your staff, your administrators, and then your families about what your building level expectations are. You do training, you engage students with it, you educate them about what it means to be engaged and appropriate use and not. That to me is the approach that you want to take. I don't know what that looks like in policy language, but
I was just thinking, that's not in these policies, what Brady is describing, right?
Yeah, the way I would also think about it, Charlie, is that's not specifically in the policy, but the policy allows for that to happen.
Right.
I mean, that's what we're doing here. We're allowing buildings to create the structures and systems to address it in a way that makes sense for them.
Right.
And so it is that overarching piece I started with and fairly loose, but it does define things that are appropriate, inappropriate, and then allows buildings to create routines and procedures off of that to deal with appropriate use. At bringing back those policies, I think what Ruthina was kind of getting at was, are they consistent enough? Or are they so different? There one building says, well, you can have it out all the time, anytime, and another one is, no, 3 strikes and we're taking the phone and only your parents can come in and get it. I think that's
Especially with our elementary school. I mean,
yeah.
Right.
that is where I think some of the biggest struggle, just speaking and knowing a lot more elementary school teachers than I do high school teachers that have talked to me, even in this last month, about what they experienced last school year with kids and cell phone, and just talking to, honestly, about 15 different teachers. They're all over the board on how they handle
Yep.
kids in the cell phone. So, and when I asked them, well, what's your building policy? They're like, what building policy? I'm like, oh Lord, it has to be something. It has to be something. So, secondary sounds to me like most of them may have a very good, at least foundation. But what I'm hearing and what we've heard as a board, stemming from elementary, what can we do to provide more structure for the buildings to work within there, and an understanding for the administrators to build that community with their staff, families, on this is what the expectations, because you can't have kids in one class doing one thing, because, you know, kids are like, but
Oh,
this
yeah.
is B class, get to use their phone every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I feel like elementary would be more conducive to having a district-wide umbrella policy. First, I think there's less of a need for the students to have a phone, and it's also an equity issue because I feel like there's probably a lot of students that don't have phones. Whatever we can do at the district level to empower our teachers to have better classroom management in terms of the cell phones. I mean, maybe we just start at the elementary level and have a policy and see how that goes.
You know, everything you just said, each building needs to have a policy.
Well,
I think you're just talking about a consistent approach for elementaries
Right,
to deal
that's
with it,
what I
right?
meant.
Oh, okay.
And Amy, did you want to jump in there with
Yeah,
what?
I would just take a quick second to say, I missed the June meeting when you guys were talking about this, and Matt and Kim did a great job of putting in what the various policies were for each of our buildings and then shared some other districts, right? Well, I took a quick peek through them, and this doc that we're looking at does a nice job of kind of talking about, like somebody said earlier, the do's and don'ts, right? What's restricted? Think back to when we talk about the 33 defined behaviors that the state has us, looking at. Like, that's the don'ts, right? Even when it comes to technology use. But where I think where we see the difference, and this happens district to district, and Adam and I have a conversation nationwide even, right? It's in the allowed use bucket and the action bucket is where we're differing as I see through the policies. And so I think that's the conversation. Like, this is pretty clear on the do's and don'ts, but it's where it's permissible, where it's not permissible across our buildings, and then the actions that happen from there. So those are the two buckets I think we're talking about, either making more standard or it's still okay to do number 7, which is each building develop their own. But what I didn't see was even sometimes defined all 3 buckets. They might have talked about allowable use and time, the restrictions, but then there was no actions, where another building might have, spoken to all 3. So.
I honestly, I agree with Jane. I think we need to have more of a concrete policy on the elementary side and let a more wiggle room for variation from buildings on the secondary side, because that time in classroom in elementary is precious time that we all know that if they lose that, being distracted by either calls coming in, because I've heard from teachers, it's like parents will call kids in the day, what the heck? Because their kid has it and they want to remind them to do X, Y, Z, and it's like, what? We need to have a more structured policy for elementaries. They're dealing with a lot already. I personally don't think, and maybe administrators for building levels will tell me, say, no, we're fine. I don't think they need that additive trying to figure out the flexibility across the board, just because it's hurting instructional time.
What I think Eliza and Amy would probably agree that I think our elementary principals respond to that pretty well, that if we had something consistent, they would actually like that and be able to know that, hey, that we're all doing the same thing. So I think my question would be, okay, today's the 2nd, right? And we have a meeting on the 9th. We won't have anything for you on the 9th. The agenda already goes out tomorrow. The 23rd is the first day of school. Are you guys comfortable with us just putting something together and kind of going ahead with it with the elementaries, and we can come back in September and kind of update you with, this is what we started the school year with? Do you want to see something at the board table? I'm just thinking about timeline for implementation since we're approaching the start of the school year, what your expectations or comfort level with that would be. We can certainly take this direction back and say elementaries, we need to get a consistent policy and get it implemented for the start of the year. And secondary, we can just make sure we're not too far off in what we're doing, and then basically give you guys an update. But if you want to see it before we move on it, then we may either need an extra meeting or we're going to need to think about how we would do that. So,
Go ahead.
I would give you the direction just to do something, right?
Okay.
Because we can all sit here and discuss what we think needs to go into that policy and tweak it however we want, and we're going to implement it, and the school's going to be like, nope, that ain't going to work, right? It doesn't matter what we're saying sitting around this table, right? So I think you have to start with something with the knowledge saying, hey, we've heard we need to put something in place, and here's our initial thing, and that's the messaging to the schools, and say, we need feedback onto what is going to work or not going to work, but with the idea of, we need something that is going to be more global at the elementary level and whatnot, and say, this is the intent, and this is how we're starting. It can be adjusted as needed, but yeah, I don't think we can start the school year without something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to start at the beginning of the year. I think
Yeah.
that's more important, to start
Right.
at the beginning of the year.
And I would say, it sounds like you have the blessing of P&G. We bring this back on the 9th as an update to the rest of the board, unless the majority of them balk at that idea. We move forward with you all putting something in place, knowing that P&G will eventually get it, and we can tweak it, and make any changes we tweak won't go into effect until next year. So there'll be a sort of policy out there, and then if we're like, oh, this probably will not work down the line, we can still tweak
Yep.
it as a committee to make it even stronger for next year.
That makes sense. So the update on the 9th could really be, we're working to establish, similar expectations, really by level, right? But trying to be a little bit more prescriptive at the elementary level to give consistent direction to our elementary schools, junior high, and high school. We feel like this framework and the way buildings have built their policies is mostly in line with our expectations for that. Elementary, we're working to try to clarify those before the start of the school year. We'll be bringing back a draft of what we did develop to P&G in September, but we'll obviously get association input and principal input into anything we start before the start of the school year.
Do we have spots, and I guess if we're focusing on elementary where it works well?
Yeah, I think we would have some buildings we could definitely say, hey, where's it going well?
And I guess just generally speaking, what's the ask from the policy standpoint? What could principals use that then is it just, here's what works really well, let's just implement this across the board? Or is it more of a, we need permission to do something that we're not able to do now?
I think the permissions are in there would be my guess. I think
Okay.
probably what we're going to find in our best examples, and Eliza's looking at me funny, so maybe she's going to say something. The permission to take away devices is in here. I mean, the permissions to do the things we need to do are in here. I think probably what you're going to see where it's working well is how they've taught the expectation to the kids and how it's reinforced, because it can't just be done punitively. I mean, the best examples are going to be how we've taught the kids appropriate uses of their devices, and that's going to be the curriculum part that has to be worked in and revisited. So
You've engaged your families, you've engaged the larger school community about the importance of it. I mean,
That's usually the only way to go, is to
Yeah.
because it's been a long time since I've had to deal with cell phones in the classroom. I'm about to go back to that. I'm not looking forward to that little piece of it. But we had no tools back then, and it wasn't, and it has to be worse almost 10 years later. I mean, the devices are just more capable of things. And every time you had a conflict, it was just, like, it was no good what they were doing with the cell phone, but the conflict was,
not commensurate with
it was worse.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, exactly.
right.
You had no backup. I mean, fourth hour and all the administrators are at lunch and you're trying to get a kid's cell phone
Yeah.
and forget about any teaching that would happen the rest of that period because you've lost all credibility. The kids, you're not taking my cell phone because what are you going to do? Have a physical altercation? Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah.
So it was really, that's to me the only way to do it, is to teach people how to use this stuff effectively, because it isn't going away. And I doubt we could realistically take them away.
And the parents, like Brady said, I think
Yeah.
communicating the stuff to the parents before the year starts, communicating to the students the first day, and re-communicating to the students about what the expectations are and when they'll have a chance to check their phones and all of that. I think the more they know that ahead of time, and we're not playing gotcha or a surprise on them, and then all of a sudden taking the phone, we avoid those power struggles you're talking about, right? And that's definitely the situation we want to avoid. And that was my fear about trying to create a super prescriptive policy, is that we're going to see more power struggles. We're going to see, things like defiance and disrespect that we
Yeah,
worked on
that's-
reducing. That's just going to go right through the roof as soon as we
But
start.
Some of the prescriptive stuff was setting expectations. You need to communicate out a lot of different ways. You definitely need to make sure to talk to the parents, because that's where you're going to run. I mean, the one thing, if you have a kid who's fine and their parents are on the same page, it's a whole nother thing if they're not.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, my kid needs their cell phone because I need to contact XYZ. And that's, I think, where you're going to have to biggest problem.
The
And
best
I-
case scenario is the least removal of cell phones from kids, right?
Yeah.
That's when we've done our job, right? And that's not going to be perfect, but the fewest amount of times we can ever ask to take a phone from a kid means that what we've done has worked. And so I think you're right. The prescriptive end is all the stuff on the front end to do that.
And I would just say, going back to the question that you prompted Adam with student-owned technology, I mean, I just think it has to continue to be framed that way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the wearable, I mean, I have to say, okay, cell phone secured,
And your watch. Yeah.
Secured. I mean, there's just all sorts of devices that are capable of being distracting and all that. So I just think it has to,
Yeah,
it's smart.
Wait till the glasses get really, really good.
Yeah.
Right.
They are,
Yeah.
or you name the brand, but.
But that's one of the things we've also seen. JP, you talked about the parents saying, I have to contact my kid. Amy and I have worked at a couple of cases with our special ed department where, I mean, they're bringing new technology that we're not even really aware about, where they want to be able to listen into the class. And it's not because they want to be able to listen to what the teacher's teaching, but it's for awareness, it's for a health emergency or pieces like that. And so there are all these nuanced situations where there are legitimate reasons that a child, and I'm not saying you're not saying there are, but I think it goes to that, how do we teach, how do we work with families, how do we work with staff, as Sean said, to get the feedback, how do we not put the burden on the teaching staff, and it's continually to evolve, and so we have to look at it from that perspective of how can we continue to evolve with it, because I mean, this was just in the last 6 months. We're like, wait, you want to like have your cell phone on all the time? And they're like, no, that's not what it is. So we had to work through what that really looked like and how that met the child's needs, but also allowed the teacher to maintain the privacy of the other students and all those other pieces that go along with that.
So that leads right into the one other, I guess, piece of guidance I would give, right? And that it came up when Brady was talking about, maybe our teachers using it for a legitimate reason, right? That, I think we've talked about this before, is you write the rule, then figure out the exceptions. And don't write the rules to the exceptions, because you will create a policy that nobody can understand or possibly follow, right?
Yeah.
That you have to be pretty cut and dry on the policy itself, and then figure out how you're gonna apply it.
Absolutely. Agreed. We got it.
Anything else? I think we can get this done after.
Right on time.
All right.
PNT is.
We do have, one other agenda item is the next policy and government is September. Are we doing before the second meeting of the month? Is that what we're doing, the fourth Tuesday?
That was our
We're doing them ahead of the board meeting to not take.
The second
next
board
one.
meeting, yeah.
Okay.
second board meeting.
Yep.
I'll take up the next one. Tuesday.
Yep.
All right. Whatever that date is.
Yep.
27?
There we go.
Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
What's the next one?